And that leads us to our presentation tonight. John has been, John, and I sent you guys his bio. He's the, I can't think of it, urban ecologist. I can't even read this. Urban ecologist for the city of McAllen at Quinta Mazatlan. He is um, super interested in plants, and he's part of the Native Plant Project. And I sent you his presentation from that. He'll answer questions on the second part, but the first part he's going to talk about the ecological regions of Texas. And let's give the floor to John. Thank you, John, for being with us.
Sure thing. Thanks for the intro. Happy to be with y'all again. Let me go ahead and share my content. And we can go ahead and get straight into it. So yeah, like just a little backstory on me is that I actually was part of the Rio Grande Valley. I went to the classes way back when I was in high school, and there's only one chapter. And so I have very fond feelings towards the RGV chapter because it was me and my mom driving over from Edinburgh over to San Benito to attend those. So that was a fun thing. So as an urban ecologist, I definitely try to think about ecological concepts as I'm going about some of my day-to-day work. And so I'll spend most of my time for this presentation focusing on ecological concepts and management stuff. And then I'll touch a little bit on ecoregions for sure, because that's included in there, but it's not going to be as in-depth. But there is an upcoming opportunity for y'all to get really in-depth on ecoregions in Texas, but I will certainly still touch on it. So we'll go start at the very basics of ecology. And the definition of ecology is just that it's the study of organisms and how they interact with each other and their environment. So ecology literally means home study. So it's studying our home here on Earth. And it has roots in a lot of observational studies of nature. So some of the really old, like natural philosophers, like some of the Greek natural philosophers, asking questions about where organisms came from. I think there was one of them that thought that a certain like animal emerged from grass or something like that. Those are kind of the base questions of ecology. But it's an extremely broad field of study. So you can have ecologists that study opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of scale, but they're both ecology and certainly study very, very different organisms as well. But it asks questions like, how do environmental conditions affect different bee species, like this megachilid bee in the upper right here? Or in turn, how do different bees interact with various flower species? So there might be some that these bees are particularly in tune with and wanting to pollinate, specialists on those, and there might be others that are generalists where they're going to multiple species. How does flower abundance impact insectivorous bird populations, right? And then what are some of the factors limiting animal or plant populations? To quote a local agroecologist, what isn't ecology? Ecology is so many things. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll have some idea of some of the main concepts that I'm going to be covering. But even more so, I just hope that it opens your mind to just the amazing interconnectivity between plants, animals, other living things, and their abiotic environments. So a lot of times when people introduce ecology, this is certainly how I learned it when I was in undergrad. You kind of talk about the scales of ecology. And so what I wanted to do is go through some of these scales and give you examples of some ecological studies that are looking at things in that scale range. So we're going to start off at what's considered the most granular or the finest scale, which is looking at individual organisms. So this is called organismal ecology. And it's focused on how an organism's structure, physiology, and behavior meet the challenges posed by its environment. So it's really investigating a lot just an organism and its environment. So, or an organism and a particular other organism in the environment. So an example study for this is this one by Soulé et al. A couple years ago, where they looked at the effect of diet and temperature on monarch butterfly wing morphology and flight ability. So here we've got, sorry, let me go back. Here we've got on the bottom caterpillar, a larval stage monarch, and up on the top we've got an adult monarch. So what they tested was the flight ability of monarchs reared at different temperatures, and then they also looked at their flight ability as compared to comparing what type or what species of milkweed they ate. Neither of Asclepias incarnata or A. syriaca are present here in the Rio Grande Valley, but A. curasabica, or the tropical milkweed, is one that is grown ornamentally and is used quite frequently in monarch butterfly gardens here in the area. What they found is that higher temperatures reduce monarch flight ability, shorter periods, shorter flight distances, and more mass loss per unit. And diet had weaker effects, but the higher cardenolide concentrations of the tropical milkweed had shorter, wider forewings. I'll give you a hint. Shorter and wider wings typically means that you're not going to be able to fly as far. So just a little aside here, there are populations of birds in the region. So species of birds. One's called the white-eyed vireo, and we have some that live here year-round. And then we have others that migrate through. And the way that you tell them apart in the hand, if you're doing bird banding, is you look at the proportions of their wings and how long their primary feathers are, which are their longest out feathers, compared to their secondaries. The longer the wing, the more that indicates that they are a migratory subspecies. Anyway, so that's an example of an organismal ecology study. And these are some of the implications of that sort of study, and this one in particular, looking at how, well, going forward with climate change, as things get warmer, it could be detrimental to their migratory behaviors. It could also mean that maybe we end up with more resident populations, like in Florida, or here in the valley. We can still see monarchs in December and January, when most of them are thought to be down in Michoacan, Mexico. Another implication could be that the tropical milkweed may not be as good to support the migratory monarchs, but it could be still very good at supporting resident monarchs. And does this mean we need to plant different milkweed species? So that's organismal. The next scale up in terms of ecology is population ecology. So in this case, you're not looking at an individual organism, you're looking at individual species or a population of individuals of a particular species. And population ecology is really focused on the factors that affect populations and how and why populations change in an area over time. So really, just to clarify, a population is just a group of individuals of the same taxa living in a particular area at a particular time, right? And so there's a really good example of looking at bird populations with this 2017 study that was known for its famous headline, 3 billion fewer birds than in 1950. And they use some really large data sets. The Breeding Bird Survey, which is the BBS, the Christmas Bird Count, the CBC, and then, of course, eBird, which is a newer but extremely valuable citizen science tool to look at 529 bird species in the US and Canada. So 529 populations, right? And what they found is that a lot of them, over half, exhibited declines and included lots of different ecological and taxonomic groups. So things that generally use forests or shorebirds or grassland birds declined a lot. But what the other found was that other species or other taxa increased, like waterfowl, raptors, and turkeys. So that's an example of a population study where they're looking at trends over time of a particular population. And in this case, it was populations of all the birds in the US and Canada, basically, going back to 1970. Here's a local example of population ecology that I participated in, where we looked at buff-bellied hummingbirds in particular, and we're looking at their relationship with urbanization or urban areas here in the Rio Grande Valley. So we looked at 4 years of point counts, which is a method where you go out and you just count birds while you're standing at a single point, and you only count birds within a certain distance of where you're standing. And we did these point counts in towns. We also did them in like wildlife refuges like Santa Ana and so on. What we found is that buff-bellied hummingbirds were more likely to be found in urban areas and greater yet relative abundances than in natural or restored woodlands. So if you are a population ecologist looking at buff-bellied hummingbirds, knowing that the valley is going to continue to urbanize, it's projected to continue to urbanize going on for decades into the future, you might surmise that buff-bellied hummingbirds probably aren't going to be too harmed by this if it continues on in the same general pattern of development. They may actually benefit and have more individuals in their population. So let's delve a little bit deeper into population ecology. So the fundamental characteristics of a population are the density, which is the number of individuals per unit area, right? So, think of a highly urban area like Houston, for example, has a very dense population of people. But when you get out to like the panhandle of Texas or West Texas, the density drops down quite a bit, right? Density in terms of population ecology is often estimated by sampling. So you go out and you collect samples of the population. You're not going to be able to go out and count every single individual in a given area because it's just way too much work, and or it might just actually be impossible because these organisms are moving around. And so, yeah, you go out and you do samples, and then you get your estimated density of individuals per unit area. I wanted to show this map of the loggerhead shrike here because this is similar to density, but it's called relative abundance, which is not the same thing in that you can't estimate the number of individuals in an area, but what relative abundance tells you is like, okay, relative to another place, how many individuals are there, or how more frequently are they encountered, or how much more abundant are they in a space than elsewhere in the world. Or you could look at it temporally over time and say, okay, they say of this relative abundance this time of year, what's their relative abundance in others? So that's what this animation shows, is the relative abundance of loggerhead shrike in the United States over time, and this is from eBird data. So we're looking at months of the year here. This is December, and I'll replay it, and you'll see how the relative abundance changes over time. as these bird populations move across the country during migration. So density is one fundamental characteristic. Dispersion is the pattern of spacing among individuals. And so the two types are clumped and uniform. Clumped is by far the more common type of dispersal. So those plants. So when you're driving down the road, a lot of times you might see a cluster of a certain type of wildflower. In this case, in the photo here, this is cowpen daisy. It could be upright prairie coneflower. It could be any other type of wildflower species. But a lot of times when you're driving down the highway, you'll only notice like clumps of them, right? Where it's like, oh, there's a section of road that seems to have a lot of upright prairie coneflower. And there's another section of road that seems to have a nice little patch of Runyon sunflower, right? It's not where as you're driving north on 281, you're going to see an exact spacing of individuals all the way up there, because that's just not how it usually works. And that's because clumping results from uneven availability of resources and reproductive strategies. So let's say you're a wetland plant, right? Here in the valley, wetlands are pretty hard to come by, right? So if you're a wetland plant, you're going to be clumped around where there's moisture, which is low-lying areas that get pools of water forming after rains or historically after floods, right? It also results from reproductive strategies. So if you are, again, let's use the cowpen daisy example, reproducing, your seeds are not really particularly well wind-blown plants, not like a milkweed seed. They don't seem to latch on to animals like sandbirds or something like that. They instead just kind of drop around, might blow a little ways, but they generally just drop right around the parent plant after the parent plant dies. And so naturally, you're going to end up with these clusters. So if you put one of them in, or the same thing with sunflowers, you put one sunflower in, you let it go to seed, sure enough, you're going to have a clump of sunflowers coming up in that patch next year. And then the last fundamental characteristics of a population is demography, which is the study of vital statistics of a population. So death rates, reproductive rates, immigration, emigration, etc. In every species, there are trade-offs between survival and traits like frequency of reproduction, the number of offspring, and the amount of parental care that these organisms provide for their offspring. And the life histories are simply the cumulative traits that have been selected for over time and help a species reproduce in their particular environment. So again, when do organisms reproduce? How often do they reproduce? And how many offspring are reproduced? And this changes depending on the species, and it changes depending on where individuals of that species might be in the world, right? So if you're in a more temperate environment of a particular species, you might have more seasonality of when you reproduce. It gets colder in the winters, and then you have a burst of productivity in the spring and summer. So if you're a bird, a migratory species of warbler, for instance, or again, we could go with the white-eyed vireo example, you're probably only going to breed in a very narrow time of year. Whereas if you're a white-eyed vireo here in the valley, you have more options in terms of what time of year you breed, because there's a longer growing season. There's not as much of that burst of activity coming out of a cold, desolate winter, like a lot of temperate areas. Related to reproduction, some species only reproduce once. This is called semelparity. Some examples of this are the century plant, which is a plant species that is seen a lot here in Texas. You can also see it in Florida, and you can see it in southwestern states like New Mexico, Arizona, and you can also see it out in California as well. But if you know anything about century plants, you know that when this stalk comes up, as in this photo, this is the flower stalk here, means that that plant does not have that much longer to live. It's going to flower for a while. It's going to, set fruit. And then after that stalk falls and dies, the plant is probably going to die pretty soon after that as well, because they only reproduce once. Mayflies are another example of similarity, in that, a mayfly emerges, mates, and dies all within a span of maybe a day or a few days, depending on the species. So this reproductive strategy is thought to arise in environments that are unpredictable and few offspring typically survive. These organisms are not providing a whole lot of parental care. It's like they put all their energy into reproducing one time before they die, and then let come what may, right? And see what happens. So this is something that in weedy plant species, in annual weedy plant species. So again, things like some of the sunflower family, things like some other weeds, amaranths, things like that as well. They grow, they put a lot of energy into reproducing, and then they die. Other organisms reproduce repeatedly, and this is called iteroperatively. Think of iterative, right? Time and time. And this may mean reproducing every year or more than once per year. So some examples that are found here in the valley, things like Texas ebony, right? They reproduce pretty much every year. You're going to go out in the summer months, late summer into the fall, and you're going to find these bean pods forming with dozens of seeds inside them that could potentially turn into new Texas ebony bean trees. Or something like a red crown parrot, which once it reaches sexual maturity, it's going to be trying to reproduce year after year after year. And for them and for the Texas ebonies, they'll do this over a very long lifespan. There's a Texas ebony in McAllen that's over 250 years old. It's off of Harvey, Main Street, kind of a little bit further west of that, but it's still producing beans, and people still collect them and try to grow new plants from the champion Texas ebony tree. And so this form of reproduction strategy often arises in environments that are more predictable. The adults are more likely to survive, and may face higher competition for resources. Population growth. So populations of all species, regardless of what their life history strategy is, have the potential to grow when resources are abundant. And exponential growth, which is this curve right here, right? This slowly petering up, and then all of a sudden you boom, you've got a lot of individuals all of a sudden. This, by the way, is, I believe, the human population growth curve here. But exponential growth happens to a population when there is abundant resources, thus allowing individuals to reproduce as fast as physiologically possible. True exponential growth assumes that resources are unlimited and that sources are unlimited. Of course, in nature, this is not typically how it works, but it does happen in bursts, right? So generally, the thought is the logistic growth curve is more accurate reflection of what happens in nature when it comes to population growth, where you might have a period of close to exponential growth for a while, but then it starts to slow down as the population reaches what is thought to be called the carrying capacity, or this K up here over time. The logistic growth curve is a model. It's not perfect, so there are exceptions to the rule. There are fluctuations that happen, so you don't just hit your carrying capacity and just stick there. It's more like an average over time, and things change with that. Different life histories are favored at different points of the logistic growth curve. So life histories that tend to thrive more on the exponential side of things, right? Short time periods, you can increase your population real fast. These are species that have faster development, shorter lifespans, more offspring at a time, high mortality rate, low offspring survival rate, and minimal parental care investment. So some examples of this. A lot of amphibians that are very common here in the Rio Grande Valley. So let's think about cane toads. Right? So cane toads are these enormous, or sometimes they're called giant toads. It's Rhinella horribilis is the scientific name, but they can lay thousands of eggs in their lifetime, and probably less than 5% of them are going to make it to reproductive, their own opportunity to reproduce, right? So there's a high mortality rate and a low offspring survival rate. The parents also don't really give much care to their offspring either. Another example would be a lot of weedy plant species, or the things that people consider weedy plants. So again, things like sunflowers, things like amaranths, and those sorts of things, where they can have hundreds and hundreds of seeds, and quickly produce lots and lots of offspring. The other end of the spectrum for this are life histories that tend to thrive at more of the carrying capacity end of things, so over longer periods of time. So these species tend to have slower development, longer lifespan, fewer offspring, a low mortality rate, a high offspring survival rate, which is partly due to high parental care investment. So a bird example of this would be the albatross. So, or some species of albatross. So some of them can live upwards of 60 years. So they're very long-lived species, but they only have an egg or two at a time. And so that would be an example of a life history that would be over on the carrying capacity side of things. So when you hear about R species, K species, this is kind of what they're talking about, where the R species are these ones in the lower left that are faster development, shorter lifespan, and the K species are those that have slower development and longer lifespan. So what are some factors that affect populations? They're split up into two types. There's density independent factors, and these are ones that do not change with population density. These are abiotic or physical factors such as weather events. So it doesn't matter how dense of a population there is, the individuals in that population are affected the same if it was a highly dense or a low density population. So things like hard freezes, droughts, floods, fires, hurricane winds, these are things that are density independent. And then the other group of factors are density dependent factors. So these do change with increasing or decreasing densities, and these tend to be biotic factors. So one example of this is competition for resources are density dependent factors. So you can imagine that if you have more and more individuals in a small or in a given space, that each of those individuals is going to be competing or is going to have fewer and fewer resources readily available for them, and they're going to have to compete with their nearest neighbors in order to get those resources. So a great example of this is I do try to grow some plants, and I know some of y'all in this meeting have assisted me with transplanting things out. But what I do is I start off a lot of times with a flat or a pot and I throw a bunch of seeds in there and I let them get started. And then once they reach a certain size, I transplant them out into their own individual containers so they don't have to compete with each other for water, for light, or for nutrients that are in my potting soil. However, if I let this in the upper right here, which is Crusita, if I let that play out, eventually what would happen is only a few of those individuals, maybe one, maybe two, would reach it to the point where they could reproduce and they would get big. So there's an example of competition and how that changes depending on how dense a population is. It also intra-specific territoriality is another type of competition that changes with density. So if you have lots of olive sparrows in a park, they're probably going to be competing more and trying to have and trying to maintain their own separate territories. And if there are fewer, you probably have a broader territory, and you're not having to chase away as many of your neighbors from entering into your territory. Disease is another density-dependent factor that affects populations. This was kind of obvious, but an example of this is with some of these avian poxes that affect house finches. So, you know, it seems like every year, every couple years, there are times when bird conservation organizations will say, hey, stop putting out your bird feeders. There's this avian pox that's going around. There's conjunctivitis going around, and you'll see these house finches or other species with these growths on their face. And the reason they're asking people to not put out their bird feeders at this point is because bird feeders are bringing in a whole bird into a small space, which increases the infection rate or the spread of those diseases. So you're basically, if you have a bird feeder out and there's a disease going around, you are creating a high density spot for those birds, and that's going to increase the rate of infection. And then predation is actually also a density dependent factor. So as a prey population gets bigger, as there's more and more prey available, predators may preferentially feed on them. So there's a cool study where they looked at this type of back swimmer, which is an aquatic insect, and found that when mosquitoes in particular reached a high population density, once they reach a certain density, these insects tended to feed on them in aquatic environments over other things. It's kind of like the ease of access, right? So if I'm driving around South Texas, it's going to be very easy for me to find a taco spot to eat, right? But it's going to be a lot harder for me to find, I don't know, let's just say like a Ukrainian or Russian or Eastern European restaurant in the same area. So I'm probably going to end up going to a taco spot if I'm looking for a quick bite to eat, rather than an Eastern European restaurant. So that's just a little human example of that. Okay, so those are some population things. I just wanted to include this quote here. I don't necessarily fully agree with it. This is kind of hating on population ecology, which I don't want to do. But it is interesting to think about in that community ecology is really looking at a bunch of different populations and how they interact with each other between different species. So you're no longer just looking at one species or one taxa. You're looking at multiple species, again, in a given area at a particular time. So yeah, with community ecology, you focus on interactions between species like predation, competition, that affect community structure and organization. So an example of this was a really cool study I found a few years ago while I was actually doing my my master's thesis. It's called Proximity to Active Accipiter Nests Reduces Nest Predation of Black-cheeked Hummingbirds, and it was really cool. So what they tested was whether the observed associations between the black-chinned hummingbird, which is a bird that nests here in the valley too, and accipiter hawk nests impacted hummingbird nesting success. And they found that, yeah, hummingbird nests within 300 meters of an active accipiter hawk nest had significantly higher probabilities of successfully fledging young. They follow this up with a key part of this equation is that they found that the reason for this is because the hawk presence made it less likely that there are going to be jays around to depredate the hummingbird nest, right? So there wasn't a direct interaction necessarily between the hummingbird and the hawk, but the hawk being around meant that something that typically eats hummingbird eggs wasn't as likely to be in the area because they were in turn being eaten by the hawk. So it's a really cool example of a community ecology study and looking at the connections and the interactions between different species. Some are direct, some are indirect. So like implications being that indirect effects of species interactions can be important for other species. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind when it comes to conservation and management of one species and how it can have ripple effects for other species down the line. An example of this gone wrong is actually cane toads as biological control in Australia, to where they thought that, oh, we can bring in cane toads to eat pests that are in our certain crops, but they did not think about the fact that the cane toads were also going to be eating many, many other things, and even things that they don't eat were going to be impacted by the presence of cane toads. So this is a local example. This is, again, one that I participated in. This is kind of the main figure that came out of my master's thesis. And just showing how observational studies can be a groundwork for any sort of ecology by just looking at what are these associations, and then you delve more into the why, or the causality of why this is happening. So in mine, I basically just went out and I counted birds in neighborhoods, and then I looked at, and then I took measurements of local environmental factors, and looked at the correlations between the abundance and presence of certain bird species and those environmental factors. Main takeaway here is that things like western kingbird, house sparrow, great-tailed grackle, mourning dove tend to be associated with areas that are more grassy and open, so fewer trees, and things like plain chachalaca, black-crested titmouse, clay-colored thrush tend to be in areas that had more trees. Interestingly, there's an interesting correlation between white-winged doves and live oaks. So a further study would be to look at, well, why is that the case? Why is there this association between doves and oak trees? Is it because they make good nest sites? Is it because in towns and cities, white-winged doves get a lot of extra nutrition from eating crushed acorns that fall into roads? So as these acorns fall into road and people walk on them or step on them, or cars drive over them, they crush them open and make that pulp inside available for birds like white-winged dove to eat that they otherwise couldn't access. That's a good question for a future study. So community ecology is about different species interacting with each other, and this can be thought of in terms of whether the interaction had a positive, negative, or neutral impact on the different species involved. So this is inter-specific interactions. Intra-specific interactions are those within a single species. So intra is single species, inter is multiple species. So you can think of it as a plus, a minus, or a neutral. So we'll go through some examples of these interspecific interactions. Competition, as I mentioned before, with density-dependent factors affecting populations. Competition is a negative-negative interaction where both individuals, both organisms are being negatively affected by the presence of the other. So a great example of this is if you're trying to grow tomatoes, another crop, you don't want weeds or other plant species coming up in the interior and taking up the moisture that you're providing via irrigation or taking up the soil nutrients that otherwise could be used by the tomato. So you come through and you put down, weed suppressing barrier, like in this photo, or you come through and pull weeds, or spray, or something like that. Competitive exclusion is what happens when one species outcompetes and extirpates another species from a given area. So these are another two species that are frequently seen here in the Rio Grande Valley. There's the brown anole on the left and the green anole on the right. The brown anole is an introduced invasive species in the southern US. And when they invade urban areas, so towns and cities, it leads to declines in the native green anole. So that would be competitive exclusion in action, to where the arrival of one species is driving out another species through competition. What's interesting is that even though they do tend to decline, they do tend to harm green anole populations. There is some evidence now that green anoles are able to coexist in a similar area due to the fact that they will just leave and go higher up in trees than the brown anoles tend to do. So this would be an example of what's called resource partitioning, where these two anole species, the brown and the green, are eating similar things, they're competing with each other, but by the green anole, quote unquote, deciding to go higher up in the environment, they are no longer competing directly for as many resources and are able to coexist. Another example of resource partitioning is time partitioning. So what time of day are these animals active or trying to utilize similar resources? There's a cool study that looked at bats using watering holes, and they found that different bat species are using the watering hole at different times. So even though they're both using the same resource, because they're using them at different times of day, they're not competing with each other for that resource. Maybe an example would be in people, right? A lot of people, go into work around 7 or 8 in the morning, and there's a ton of people competing for space on the road, right? And it leads to bad traffic. But then there are other people that are working night shifts, and they're not competing with the people during the day because they're using the roads at an entirely different hour, right? So that would be a human example of that. So that's competition, which is a negative-negative. Predation is a positive interaction. So your classic example is one species or one organism preying upon another. So here's a zone-tailed hawk eating a killdeer at a Cerro Grande park. This was a few years ago now. It's kind of an old video. But that's a classic example of predation or a positive, which is a positive interaction. Another example of how predation kind of impacts species interactions is looking at Chile piquins and their relationships with mammals and with birds. So mammals are seed predators of Chile piquins, right? We have things like this desert wood rat, Neotoma lepida, has molars. So when it's eating fruit seeds, it's chewing them all up, and it's actually killing that seed a lot of times. So the Chile piquin doesn't want to be depredated by this wood rat. And so these chili piquins have lots of capsaicin, which is what the spice is, right? And so the wood rats don't end up eating the chili piquin anymore. And birds like the curved-billed thrasher and mockingbirds that don't have molars to chew aren't affected by the capsaicin and continue to eat them and then spread the seeds around in the world. So next time you eat a chili, you can think about how the plant doesn't want you to be eating it necessarily because you are a seed predator, as opposed to if you're a bird and you just, popped it in and swallowed it whole. The plant's like, that's great, fantastic. But the bird also probably doesn't get to experience that wonderful spicy flavor of chilies. Parasitoidism is another positive-negative interaction. So parasitoids are different than parasites in that they kill their host, right? And so I'm sure some of y'all have seen these blue-eyed ensign wasps. Sometimes you'll know, when growing up, I used to notice them get into my house, and I'd be like, oh, what's that weird-looking fly? Well, turns out it's a wasp, and they are parasitoids of the American cockroach. So what they do is they find the egg sacs that these American cockroaches lay. They lay their own eggs inside that egg sac, and then their babies eat the developing cockroach babies. So if you're not a fan of cockroaches, you're going to be rooting for more and more of these ensign wasps around. Herbivory is also a plus-minus interaction, and plants develop features to try to deter herbivory. Here in the valley, there's lots of examples of this. There are things that have nasty chemicals in them. There are things that develop lots of spines or thorns or prickles to try to prevent being eaten. But at the same time, the things that are eating the plants, the herbivores, are developing behaviors or physiological mechanisms to work around those plant adaptations. So it's a evolutionary race, kind of, to see who can develop new things first. So a classic example of this is prairie milkweed or other milkweed species in the genus Asclepias and monarchs, right? To where these milkweeds have those cardenolides, which are toxic to a lot of organisms, but monarchs actually are fine with that and in fact benefit from eating those chemicals because it then makes them in turn toxic to potential predators as well. Mutualism is a win-win interaction. It's a positive-positive. And some classic examples of this are pollinators in plants, and then seed dispersers in plants. So things like this Mexican feather-tongue bee on the stinking passion flower is a great example of a win-win, where the bee is getting nectar and pollen resources to use for either its own sustenance or to feed its offspring. A lot of bees will gather up a bunch of pollen and then stuff it into a cell and then lay their eggs in the cell. And then once their eggs hatch, they'll eat that pollen store that's in there. And then the plant, of course, is getting pollinated, which is helping them reproduce in turn. Another example are things like frugivorous birds. Clay-colored thrushes are an example, or northern mockingbirds, or great kiskadees, or chachalakas that love to come through and eat fleshy fruited fruits or berries, like the brush holly. They'll eat them. They're not harming the seed inside. And in fact, they're cleaning off the pulp with their chemical digestive system, which is taking away the things that might be inhibiting that seed from germinating. Then they poop it out somewhere far away from the parent with a nice store of nitrogen and a nice clean seed. Voila, you have a new brush holly potentially able to grow. There's some cool third party, what I am calling hidden third party mutualisms, where it seems like one interaction may be in effect, but if you include another one, it changes. So an example of this is nectar robbing carpenter bees. And always used to think that they negatively impacted the plants that they robbed from, right? They're coming in, and in the case, this is a carpenter bee feeding on the Turk's cap. And instead of going through the top of the Turk's cap flower, where it has its pollen on its anthers, and also that's where the stigma style are as well, to get that pollen to drop off its sperm down in the ovaries. They are instead just going straight to the bottom where the nectaries are, cutting a hole in the side and drinking it out. So I was like, oh, that's got to be a negative interaction because the bee is simply stealing from the plant and not doing its job. But some nectar robbers still pollinate the plants they steal from. There's a study that found that. And then that behavior of stealing can also influence other pollinators, and it can increase flight distance, which means more gene flow in the plant population. So if I'm a buff-bellied hummingbird and I'm in a forest with lots of Turk's cap around, and there's these carpenter bees that come in and are stealing the nectar, which is what I want from the plant, I might go from flower to flower, and I might go further and further distances just to get enough nectar to support me. But at the same time, I'm actually increasing the gene flow between individuals of the Turk's cap. Commensalism and amensalism are either positive, neutral, or negative neutral interactions. And these are difficult to document in nature because any close association between species likely at some level impacts both species, even if only slightly. But a classic example of commensalism that people often use are when birds follow behind other organisms and catch things that are flying out or being disturbed by the other organism walking through. So it could be grackles following someone mowing the lawn. It could be cattle egrets following behind a tractor and eating the insects the tractor is stirring up when it's plowing land. It could be hawks, like white-tailed hawk, crested caracara, turkey vulture, raptors and vultures going to where cane fields are being burned, right? So people are not impacted necessarily by the presence of the hawk. They're not really gaining or getting harmed by the presence of that. But the hawks or the vultures are benefiting from the cane being burned. However, when I think about it with the grackles and the lawnmower, I actually think this is a mutualistic relationship, at least with me, because when I'm mowing the lawn or when I'm out there pulling guinea grass and I've got grackles around me, I actually consider that I am also gaining a positive experience here because I simply enjoy having grackles around me. So to me, it becomes a mutualism where the grackles get food from me rustling around, rustling around in the grass, and then I get enjoyment by getting to look at these pretty birds following around behind me. Let me take a quick sip of water. Okay. So the structure and dynamics of an ecological community largely depend on the trophic structure, or who eats who, right? This is the typical food chain model, right? Where you've got your primary producers and your primary consumers, secondary, tertiary, and so on up the line. And this one's also showing how very little energy relative produced at each level is getting passed on up the trophic chain. When in reality, community trophic structure is really more of a web as opposed to a chain. So there's a lot of interconnections to where organisms are eating each other and eating other things. And so it's not as simple as a chain. There are some species that have especially large impacts on the structure of communities. So there are two different kind of types of these large impact species. There's dominant species, where they're simply the most abundant or that collectively have the highest biomass. So in this example, krill probably are a dominant species in that there's billions and billions of them in the ocean, right? And if you probably added up the weight of them, they'd weigh a ton. So this is a dominant species, and all these other species at some level are probably dependent on krill and some other things. A local example could be mesquite. So in old pastures where there used to be cattle or goats grazing, you'll often notice that there are tons of mesquite trees that come in initially. And they are setting the stage in some ways of what other plant life is going to come into that area in the long run, to where they actually change microclimates. So they're introducing just enough shade to where things can grow underneath them well, and helping conserve, adding nitrogen back to the soil through dropping their leaves and stuff. And so some plants like woody plant species really like that. Birds will also come in and land on a mesquite tree and poop out seeds that they've eaten, and other things like the really sun-loving grasses and things like that don't do as well. So that's an example of a dominant species that can have a large impact on the structure of a local community. And then there's keystone species, and beavers are a great example of this, right? Where they are creating wetlands. They dam up a creek, dam up a river, and then that causes it to spread out, that water to spread out over an area and create all these other microhabitats for different organisms to occupy. Disturbance in an environment influences species diversity and composition in a community. So a disturbance is simply an event that changes a community by removing organisms from it or altering resource availability. And disturbance is just part of it. Most communities are constantly changing due to disturbances. So an example of a disturbance could be a tree, like this Texas ebony tree, falling, right? Maybe there was a hurricane, maybe the tree just got old and died, maybe something came in and like a disease and caused it to rot and die. Regardless of how, it fell over, it died. And that sunlight that's barely peeking through its canopy is now reaching the forest floor in full effect. So that tree falling and leaving that canopy space open means that all these other things that wouldn't be able to get light before are now getting light. It might cause different species to germinate. It might allow other trees to start reaching up and competing for that light space. So the initial disturbance is changing the composition of that local community. And the intermediate disturbance hypothesis is that moderate levels of disturbance foster greater diversity than low or high levels of disturbance. Where high levels of disturbance can be too disruptive to a community, and low levels can lead to a few dominant species excluding others. So this example in the lower right is very familiar to me because it deals with urban bird communities. And this is stuff done by John Marslow up at University of Washington. And what he and his students have done is a lot of bird counts across the urban-rural gradient. So going from like downtown cities out to exurban or peri-urban or rural environments where there's more quote-unquote natural habitats. And what they found is that in these intermediate areas of forest cover, there's actually the highest diversity of bird species. Over here on the left, where the 0% of forest is like the downtown areas like Seattle or other cities in the Pacific Northwest. And then over here on the right would be like a true natural forested area. So you can see they actually have lower bird species diversity than in the middle, where some species from both sides are still occupying the environment. So that's the idea behind the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. Ecological succession is the process by which the structure of a community changes over time following that disturbance. So we talked about a tree falling as an example of this. And most of our familiar examples of ecological succession are forms of secondary succession, where an existing community has been cleared, but soils are left intact. So this could be if there was like a fire, for instance, a wildfire that came through and burned up a lot of the existing vegetation, leaving a lot of bare soil. Each ecological succession would be the series of changing communities over time since that initial fire disturbance. So in a forest community, this is what it would often look like, where you've got the bare soil here on the left, grasses and forbs start to invade in the second and third stage. There might be some more shrubs once you get over here to the fourth. Trees are starting to develop by the next stage, and then in the last stage, you've got mostly trees and very few forbs and shrubs, except where there's enough light to get through. I feel like it's important to recognize that people have long been important agents of disturbance. I highly recommend reading this study. It's confusing, but the gist of it is really, I feel like, important for people to be aware of. But the title is People Have Shaped Most of Terrestrial Nature for at least 12,000 years. So even 12,000 years ago, nearly 3/4 of the Earth's land was inhabited and shaped by people, including 90% of temperate and tropical forests. And they recognize that a lot of the lands now characterized as natural or intact or wild generally have long histories of human use, and that current global biodiversity patterns are more strongly associated with past patterns of land use than present ones in regional natural lands. So an example of this, just to make it a little more apparent, but I have been fortunate enough to go to the Yucatan a few times, and in those areas around the ruins, there are these beautiful forests with all these tall trees. And I remember thinking, oh man, these areas are like super wild and it's reclaimed by nature, and you can't really even see the influence of the peoples that lived here before except the ruins themselves. But I was wrong, because there's been studies that show that the tree species found around these ruins reflect ancient Mayans' forest gardens. So where the choices that the Mayans were making about what trees they grew in their spaces are still affecting the plant species diversity today, which in turn is affecting bird species diversity, like this turquoise-browed motmot, or like these other ones. So I think it's really important to think about that. There's a term, it's called legacy effects of what's happened at the land, in a landscape before, and how legacy effects still play a lot of role into what is happening now, as in the past. So just something to be aware of when you're reading about wildernesses and things like that. Another example of this in the U.S. is John Muir was a huge fan of Yosemite, and he remarked that it was pure wilderness and no mark of man visible. But he did not know, or was not aware, or did not want to know, perhaps, that wilderness where no mark of man was visible had been managed by indigenous peoples for hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years before Muir was around. And so in the early 1900s, there's an indigenous woman named Totuya who was taken back to Yosemite after all her peoples had been either killed or forced off of this land generations ago. And she brought back and she said, "It's too dirty. It's too much bushy." And so the indigenous peoples would encourage wildfires and it would clear out a lot of the brushy areas and maintain the prairie habitats where they would hunt deer, or they would harvest certain plants, or they would domesticate certain plants. And so what John Muir thought of as being like absolutely gorgeous, pristine environment was actually the result of the Native Americans that he kind of looked down upon. So my point here is not to be too preachy about this, but my point here is that I think it's really important that we rid ourselves of the notion that humans and nature are separate and that we can only harm nature. We certainly have the capacity to repair and create lifeful systems and learn how to have more positive relationship with other species in our communities. A lot of times in the conservation game, you hear about how, oh, people are impacting the environment, and it's almost always a negative impact. But I think it's important to recognize that that's not always the case, and that we can certainly, and while we can certainly do better in our communities, not everything that people do is automatically bad when it comes to biological conservation. Okay, that was the biggest section because I feel most comfortable with community ecology, population ecology, and organismal ecology. But there are some other scales in that hierarchy as well. So I will kind of briefly go through some of these. These are not my areas of expertise, just want to be completely transparent there. But it's important to at least get y'all thinking about other layers of this these ecological hierarchies. So the next level up above like community ecology, which is looking at biotic interactions, right, between species, between individuals of species, is to switch over into ecosystem ecology, where you're introducing the abiotic factors that are going into it, like how much sunlight you're getting and things like that. So in ecosystem ecology, you're emphasizing energy flow and chemical cycling between organisms and the environment. And I think it's important to actually read the definition of an ecosystem because you'll hear it thrown around quite a bit. But an ecosystem is just the community of organisms in an area and the physical factors with which those organisms interact. So an ecosystem can be a variety of sizes, quote unquote, right? You could have a glass, and then people do this, right? You can get those like big black glass containers and put things inside, and you have like a little self-sustaining ecosystem, or an ecosystem could be as large as like the entire world, right? So it's relative to where you're thinking about, but it's simply organisms in an area and the physical factors with which those organisms interact. There's also landscape ecology, which focuses on the factors controlling exchanges of energy, materials, and organisms across multiple ecosystems, right? So we're no longer thinking about just one ecosystem, we're thinking about interactions between ecosystems. So in the valley, that could be thinking about how the Laguna Madre ecosystem is impacted by ecosystems upriver, even going up to the headwaters of the Rio Grande itself, right? So that would be landscape ecology. And then global ecology examines these flows at a global scale. The largest scale that we can think of on the Earth itself. This is real basic stuff, but physical laws govern energy flow and chemical cycling in ecosystems. So there's the laws of thermodynamics, conservation of energy, conservation of mass. My main point here with this energy and chemical cycling flow is just that detritivores are very important. That's my takeaway from this, is that a lot of times we don't appreciate mushrooms and insects that are eating dead things as much as we do appreciate like plants, and we appreciate primary consumers like insects and big predators like mountain lions and things like that, because they help reintroduce that that energy back into the system and help make available chemicals for things to grow and thrive again. Energy and other limiting factors control primary production. So sunlight is obviously a really important primary limiting factor. So in aquatic ecosystems, the further down you go into the water, the less light is penetrating the bottom. And then nutrients and water availability is really important as well, especially in things in desert environments. I mentioned this earlier, but energy transfers between trophic levels is typically only 10% efficient. So 90% of the energy available at one trophic level is typically not transferred to the next level. So this caterpillar is only gaining about 10% of the energy that this plant is creating. And then if a bird eats that caterpillar, it's only getting about 10% efficiency of that energy as well. So ultimately about 0.1% of the chemical energy fixed by photosynthesis works its way up the food chain to an apex predator. And that can help explain short food webs. This is really not my area of expertise, biogeochemical cycles, but it's definitely important to know about how carbon is becoming available and unavailable in an ecosystem. Water cycle is another important cycle. Evaporation, condensation, and precipitation. I've thought more and more about the water cycle, especially in the past year, because Falcon reaching its 9.5% lowest in history point last summer. So I've been thinking a little bit more about water, and it's a really important limiting factor for primary production and decomposition in a terrestrial ecosystem. So thinking about why it's important for decomposition, if you do composting, right, you can have a bunch of dry materials like dead leaves and things like that. And yeah, over time, they are going to break down because there'll be some moisture that's gained from rain and dew and things like that. But it's when you add wet materials too, or you water it, that you're going to speed up that decomposition. Touched on carbon cycle. But the key processes being photosynthesis, cellular respiration, volcanoes, and then burning fossil fuels. Those are kind of some of the main key processes in the carbon cycle to be aware of here. I want to make sure that when I say autotrophs, people don't automatically translate that to plants, because of course there are other organisms that photosynthesize, like cyanobacteria, things like that. Nitrogen cycle is really important. I like learning more about the nitrogen cycle. I'm engaged to a soil scientist who did a study on cover cropping, which is all about, or well, not all about, but largely about, largely dependent on the nitrogen cycle. Learning about how atmospheric nitrogen becomes available for plants to uptake, and then for organisms like ourselves to use, because it's important that we have it. It's a part of our amino acids, our proteins, our nucleic acids, and it's often a limiting nutrient for plants. One of the cool ones for nitrogen fixation is that there's these relationships that plants have with bacteria where plants will develop these nodules on their roots. This is frequently seen in legumes, so bean plants. So some common ones that you could see and you could actually pull up and experiment with is things like bundle flower, Desmanthus fregatus is one that has nodules, or there's the little burr medic that grows up in fields. So it has a little yellow flower. It's a cool season plant, and it gets these burr-like bean pods, but they're actually beans. If you unfurl them, it's just a pod that's super condensed. anyways, if you pull one of those out by the roots, you'll see these little pink nodules. And inside those nodules are nitrogen fixing bacteria that are fixing atmospheric nitrogen and making it available to the plant. The plant, in turn, is giving the bacteria sugars from photosynthesis. What I learned from my fiance is that the plant has the power in the relationship, and where the plant can actually turn off the sugar access to those bacteria and basically be like, you get no more food, basically, and you're done. So it's wild to think about. But after that plant sheds leaves or drops bean pods or dies, that nitrogen that was made available to it by the cyanobacteria then becomes available to other plants as well. And so for sustainable ag folks, doing cover cropping where you grow a bean and it fixes nitrogen and then you till it back into the soil is a way to add available nitrogen for your crop plants. And that kind of is a good transition to talking about restoration ecology and sustainable development. So ecological restoration is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. You're aiming to recreate a community that is similar to your reference site. And you're trying to implement the features and processes needed to sustain the characteristic community, and you're wanting that the restored system has the potential to be self-sustaining. So if we were doing ecological restoration here in the valley and we had a plot of land, what we would do is we'd go out and look at the nearby ecological communities that have similar environments to the site, looking at soil type, water availability, what the biological communities are, what plants are there, what animals are there. And then we'd select, probably in this stage, plant species found in those communities, and then plant them, and then hope that eventually it reaches this restored state. In many ways, ecological restoration is about speeding up succession, where you're removing limiting factors that are preventing these ecosystems from reaching a state of relative stability, but keeping in mind that there's always going to be some disturbances. So at a small scale, one example of a way to remove those limits or get rid of invasive competitors would be to do things like tilling or tarping, or getting rid of the invasive species that are present and then starting from the ground up with the ecological succession. Here's an example of a local ecological restoration. This is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife doing their Rio reforestation. I don't know if they've had any the past couple years, but I think they're planning on bringing it back. It's a great event where they get volunteers to go out and plant thousands of native tree and shrub plants that either they've grown or other local nurseries have grown in these old ag fields. I got to do one of these when I was a kid, and it was pretty formative. I still remember digging up this clod of dirt and putting in one of those paper bands that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife grows that it's in. So sustainable development, and keeping in mind that we are part of an ecosystem, in that we also have the volition and the power to create spaces that are better for other organisms as well as us. Sustainable development is about balancing the needs of different members of the ecological community and trying to create a system that's productive and healthy over long periods of time. Can't ignore the needs of people, and it should ideally increase the quality of life for people and wildlife. And in a sustainable development system, you're you're trying to increase the ecosystem services that are available for people, as well as increasing the ecosystem services available for wildlife at the same time. Okay. I'll just quickly go over this. This is basically just a call to action that we do need to change the way that we're managing our ecosystems. You can look up the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment from 2005, but basically it's saying that a lot of the ecosystem services that we get from the environment are being degraded or used unsustainably. And that if we continue the way we're going, we have increasing risk of non-linear changes, e.g., scary word, collapses. And we need to implement some changes to try to avoid that. I'm going to very quickly blaze through some of the ecoregions, and then I want to spend a little more time talking about the valleys ecosystems. The reason I want to go through the ecoregions faster is there's a really good presentation coming up with the Texas Master Naturalist Tuesdays, who is going to be really exploring the ecoregions of Texas, and I am assured that Laura is going to do a far better job than I would do on looking at ecoregions. So I highly encourage you to go listen to her for that. But I will just briefly go over kind of what the 11 ecoregions are, and at least go through these slides so you can get an idea going into that other lecture that I hope you will attend. This information is also available in your textbook as well. But kind of going from east to west in Texas, you start off with the piney woods, which is kind of this open habitat, a lot of pine trees. There's some really interesting organisms in there. In terms of birds, there are things like red cockaded woodpecker and some interesting nuthatches that live over in those habitats. These would also be the areas that people used to think that the ivory-billed woodpecker still lived as well. The swampy piney woods areas. Go a little bit further east and you get into post-oak savanna, which is, so there's lots of oak trees as the name implies, but they're in kind of scattered or clumped dispersal in the environment in these otherwise prairie habitats. Blackland prairie. So the difference between savanna and prairie is just that in a prairie, you have fewer trees than you do in a savanna, where it's scattered trees in an open space. The Blackland and prairies are more like dominated by herbaceous plants like native, like grasses and wildflowers and things like that. Cross Timbers prairies is another one. I don't think I've actually ever been into the Cross Timbers prairies, so I have very little to say on that one. Edwards Plateau. So this one has some really interesting animals living in it. You get into some of the caves up there and you can find these endemic species of animal that are living in the caves. They're often blind, they're very pale looking. So definitely some cool endemic species up there. It's also the part of Texas where you're probably going to see things like black-capped vireo and golden-cheeked warbler as well. Rolling plains, so gently rolling hills with a lot of herbaceous plants growing in there. High plains, so higher elevated, there's plateaus. The Trans-Pecos, I went to Big Bend way back when I was a kid. So this is more desert-like, lots of thorny plants, absolutely gorgeous country from what I remember, and a very different pretty different bird community from what we have here. Some plants, a lot of plants and similar. Gulf prairies and marshes. So this is one that we do get some of here in the Rio Grande Valley. So we obviously have a barrier island of South Padre Island there. And if you're going around in the Laguna Madre or on the Laguna Madre side of South Padre, you're going to encounter these wetlands with emergent grasses, mangroves, things like that. When you get inland, you're going to see places. I'm sorry, I skipped overhead. When you get inland, you'll see coastal prairies. So imagine driving to South Padre Island along Old 100. And you pass through these areas right near STEC, in fact, right? You're in the coastal prairie there, and there's a lot of yuccas growing, and there's a lot of cordgrass and other herbaceous plants in that area. And that's where you're going to see things like Aplomado falcon. You're going to see Chihuahuan raven. Some other interesting things you see out there. That's actually one of the places where I've seen the most Philandier's fiddlewood that I know for sure is wild growing. It's over in the coastal prairies as well. This is also where you're going to get the lomas, the clay lomas that have some interesting plants growing on them as well. And then South Texas Plains is what makes up the most of our lower Rio Grande Valley habitat, characterized by plains of thorny scrub and trees, scattered patches of palms, and subtropical woodlands. It is thought that it used to be much more dominated by grasslands than it is now. And now a lot of what were grasslands is thorny brush. And one of the things that brought about that change was the introduction of cattle and horses into the area. So ranching, overgrazing grasslands changed the plant community there to where, as the cows are eating a lot of grass and pastures and sometimes not being moved around or rotated as much as they should, and then they're pooping out seeds of mesquites and other legumes that are in then turn creating favorable microclimates for other woody species to come in. So there's an old account where they talked to people that were this is hundreds of years ago, and they asked in the 1800s, and they asked these people about the habitats in these areas, and they said it's much more forested than it used to be. Back earlier in their lifetimes. Sometimes we're considered let me change that. So this is the South Texas Plains ecoregion. It has a lot of overlap with what's called the Tamaulipan Biotic Province, and sometimes you'll hear these used interchangeably. They're very similar. And then sometimes we're considered part of the Matamoran district of the Tamaulipan Biotic Province. So on this image on the left there, you can see there's this Matamoran district. And it's because we are kind of distinct from other parts of this Tamaulipan Biotic Province or the South Texas floodplains. So a little bit about our biodiversity here. There's over 1,200 species of plant, over 500 species of bird, over 300 species of butterfly, and over 110 species of dragonflies and damselflies. And in general, the reason why we have such a high biodiversity is because of our location and how we have all these different climatic influences and habitat influences kind of converging in a relatively small space. So we have western species that are on the eastern edge of their range, like this black phoebe, very common in the western US, but it just barely gets over to the valley on the eastern edge of its range. We have temperate species that we're on the southern edge of their range, so like American robin. Most winters you'll see a American robin somewhere in the valley, but not too many of them, and they don't breed in the area. They breed a lot to our north. And then we have tropical species like green jays that are on the northern edge of their range. And then we have widespread species. So there are breeding populations of yellow warblers, from as far north as the northern United States and Canada, and then they also breed down into the tropics as well. So there are some things that are just kind of widespread across the Americas. Plants, as an example of this, there's a study by Leonard and Judd that looked at the affiliations of our plants, woody plant species, and they found that roughly half of our woody plant genera are widespread in Mexico, and a little more than a third have strong affinities with southwestern deserts. A little bit about our abiotic portion of our ecosystem. We do tend to be pretty hot. You tend to be hotter the further west you go in the valley by temperatures. So you got Rio Grande City in the red, the McAllen area, and then Brownsville area in the yellow. And the warmest times of year are June through August typically, and the coldest are December and January. We're kind of on the semi-arid side of subtropical climate, but we do have some periods that we can get some pretty nice rainfall. September, by far, is our most, on average, the time of year we get the most rain. But during the late spring, early summer, and May and June, we can sometimes get those really heavy thunderstorms that come through. And when that happens, and you get those really heavy thunderstorms in May and June, it can really impact the local biological community. Thinking especially of things like amphibians. So there's these really cool toads called Mexican burrowing toads that you pretty much will only see after those sorts of heavy rainfalls, because they emerge from their underground burrows, try to mate real quick while there's tons of water, and then they disappear until the next time it happens. Hathcock split up the valley into these different physiographic zones, so keeping in mind geological factors as well as biotic communities there. This is kind of what they came up with. There's the Aguilares Plain way out west when you get towards Falcon. There's the Bordas Cuesta and a lot of what I would call the ranch country of Star and Hidalgo County. There's the Upper Valley Floodplain right along the river, mostly in Star County. And then there's the Sand Sheet to our north. So as you drive north, on 77 or 281, eventually you're going to notice that the habitat starts changing, and you'll notice that the soils tend to get a lot sandier, and there are many different plant and animal species that occur there that don't occur in kind of the lower portions of the Rio Grande Delta. Highly recommend reading through this USGS International Borderland of Concern, as it has all this sort of cool information about the physiographic zone. What are some of the primary plant and animal species of conservation concern in those areas? And what are some of the primary invasive plant species in those areas? So highly encourage you to download this. I use this resource all the time as a reference, and it's free. It's from the U.S. Geological Survey, so you can download it and read it anytime. And then I also wanted to shout out my dad's book, because he did a lot of delving through historic records of what the valley used to be like historically. And so I am going to end there. I know I went a little bit 20 minutes longer, and I still sped through a lot of stuff. I went through 20 minutes longer than I think I was originally intending to. I know I sped talked through a lot of it, but I hope it was useful information. Thank you, Roberto, for sharing the publication there in the chat. And I'm happy to answer questions about my presentation and or about the Native Plant Project talk that I gave somebody. So,
Were you
anyways,
gonna
happy to.
tell them about some of
happy
the
to-
comments?
Yes, John. So there were a couple of questions that I'll look through in the chat. One question that came up was, is there a way to feed birds and limit disease spread?
Um, typically the recommendation is if you notice that there seems to be a lot of diseased birds, you just stop feeding for a while. That's like the easy answer there. So if you're, have your bird feeders out and you notice that there's quite a few birds that have weird growths on their faces, to just stop feeding for a while, to stop congregating them in, and then after, a few weeks, a month, a few months, put the bird feed out again, and you should be good to go. So I hope that answers that question.
One comment from Diana. We've covered with our students how human disturbances truly impact the environment. Can't wait to share some of this information with them. Jake said, highly recommend the book, The Sixth Extinction. If you are into learning about that, wonderful book by a wonderful author.
I'm gonna throw in another cool book recommendation that really changed my perspective on thinking about conservation and kind of people's place in the environment, and it's called Wild Souls by Emma Maris.
Could you say that again?
I put it in the chat. It's
Oh,
called
okay.
Wild Souls by Emma
Wild
Maris.
Souls. Okay.
And I read that recently, and I was really impressed by it. It caused me to really kind of reevaluate some things. Certainly, it just creates an interesting argument to some of the more traditional conservation talking points. Catherine has a question about the Native Plant Project talk. Let's see here. I mentioned that BONAP, the Biota of North America program, is a comprehensive list of plants you can search by county and zip code. Does it include non-native species? It does. It does include non-native species. So let me share my screen again here, and I'll go to this and show you. Sorry. Let me go to BONAP. This is the Biota of North America program. This is what a lot of botanists have recommended to me to look at kind of the distribution of plants and where they're thought to be native or non-native. But you can go to this Taxonomic Data Center query page, TDCQ, and you can go to search by zip code. So 78542 is my zip code. Oh, they don't have that. Well, let me do it by county then. I'm going to do Texas, and I'll do Hidalgo. Oops. And it's going to give you a list of 1,471 plants there. Sorry. But not all of these plants are going to be considered native. Now, what you can do is you can go through and go through nativity, I believe. Or no, yeah, here we go. Exotics, here we go. And you can click that and run query. And then it's giving you only the exotic plants there. You could also do nativity, and you can do state, province level, continental native, and run query. And it's going to give you plants that are only considered native to the continent. But to answer your question, it's not very good using this method to separate out what's invasive and non-invasive. It's just going to give you a straight up list of plants that are here. Yeah, we go to chat. See what's happening. Any other questions? Let's see here.
I have a question, Mr. Brush.
Sure.
I wanted to know more about the Native Plant Project. Can you share more about that?
I actually I think I think Barbara and Roberto might be better people to ask.
Mhm.
The Native Plant Project meets monthly. I believe it's the every fourth Tuesday of the month, and they meet at the Valley Nature Center in Weslaco. So it's a community of people that are just native plant enthusiasts. There's some really nice people, really great people involved there that are extremely knowledgeable in native plants. And they actually bring in plants themselves that you can donate and acquire for your yard. Sometimes they think they do seed exchanges to where you can try to grow some of your own native plants. And then they also host speakers on those fourth Tuesdays. So you can learn more about something related to native plants. So last one that I went to was Barry Knoll, who is actually helps people study moths and butterflies, but he's talking about host plants and how some of the different local moths and butterflies host on some of our different native plant species. Is that helpful, Michelle, about the native plants?
Yeah, and there's some more resources in the chat that I just saw get posted right now. Thanks. It sounds really good. Can we do stuff like that as well for our advanced training? I'm curious.
Absolutely. Those meetings will certainly count as advanced training for any master naturalist. So for sure.
Awesome. Thank you.
I see a question. I'm just working down the chat here. I see a question from Jody about the phenology project. So I will very quickly go through and show y'all how to find that information. And then I'm going to drop a link to a blog post that I wrote about how to go about what I'm doing right now. So let me drop the link real quick here. But basically the backstory is I was really interested in thinking about when plants bloom and fruit in the Rio Grande Valley, since obviously plants are really important for wildlife. And so I was like, oh, let me create an iNaturalist project, how to do that. So that's a link I just dropped in the chat to the blog post on how you can do it. And then let me share my screen again and show you the website itself. So if you go to iNaturalist.org, it's a free website. I use it a ton. It's one of my favorites, probably my favorite app on my phone and one of my favorite websites. It's really helped me learn so much about local plants and animals. I would definitely not know nearly what little I do know without iNaturalist. So the project itself, so I can see again. The project itself is called, let me actually go to it real quick. Sorry. It's called Allergy Phenology Flowers. I'm going to drop that in the chat once I'm done here. But yeah, Allergy Phenology Flowers. So basically how it works is it uploads an observation of a plant, and it has what's called a flowering annotation. right here. So it says plant phenology flowering because observation is showing this Dahlia species in bloom. It automatically gets added to this project. So if you upload an observation of Visace blooming to iNaturalist and someone comes along or you add a flowering annotation to that observation, it will automatically be added to this project. And the way that I usually visualize or look at this data is I use this search tab and I'm going to put in a plant species. Let's do Visace since we just talked about it. So Sweet Acacia, Visace, Bachilia farnesiana, and I'm going to click About. You'll notice that my location, this is my location filter up here, so I already have it set for the lower Rio Grande Valley of Texas. I could change that out, and I can make it for Texas as a whole. I can make it for Cameron County, Texas, but I'm going to stick to lower. And then I hit plant phenology and relative proportions of observations. So what this graph is showing you right now is the relative number of observations. So this is taking into account that there are different numbers of observations added over time, and it's trying to kind of smooth that out a little bit. But this basically shows you that if you want to see Visace blooms, you have to get out in February and March because it really doesn't bloom any other time of year, at least according to the iNaturalist data, which is nearly 500 observations of that plant species. I could also go in and search. Let's find one that's going to bloom year round. Okay, let's do Promolena rada, which is Rusita. Again, same thing, plant phenology, relative proportions. And you'll see that it has kind of these spikes of bloom period, but mostly it's going to be blooming in the fall, whereas it has a closely related species called Oliva azurea that mostly blooms in the spring. So anyways, that's how you would look through and scan that and look through that phenology data for the Lower Rio Grande Valley. And that that blog post I shared is the way to it's a kind of a step-by-step way to go through that process. Let's see. Okay, the next question that I'm seeing is regarding Turk's cap. We have lots of hummingbirds. We are interested in planting Turk's cap. Are they easy to grow? From my experience, yes. They are very easy to grow. In that, what I do, and I see that this is you, Mary Alice. So you saw my plant propagation tables, but basically, I threw in a bunch of cleaned Turk's cap seed, right? So how I do that is I gather the Turk's cap fruits, I set them out on either newspaper or paper towel, and I let them dry for a while until they're like completely dry and shriveled, and then I just kind of remove or peel off the remaining skin and pulp, and then I just basically plant those seeds in a pot, a whole bunch of them, water them, let them get started, and then once they get big enough, I transplant them out into their own individual containers. So it doesn't take a whole lot that's special. I think if I can do it, I think any of y'all can do it. It's not something difficult. Next one from Mary Grizzard. Do you have a best resource you would recommend that would best identify the native plants of South Padre Island? Well, the typical, I mean, the overall one that's going to be the best for native plants in terms of a physical field guide is going to be Plants of Deep South Texas. I can't remember the name of it, but there is a more specific plant book for coastal areas. And I can't for the life of me remember the name of it, but I think that they have it, they might have it, or at least know about it at South Padre Island Birding and Nature Center. I don't know, Barbara or Roberto, if y'all know which one I'm talking about. I can visualize the book cover, but I can't remember the name of it. I'm sorry.
Is it the Wildflowers and Other Plants of Texas Beaches and Islands by Alfred Richardson?
That sounds right. Yeah.
I'll type that into the chat.
Okay. Thank you.
But when I went to buy that, because when I first moved here, that was recommended to me too, it was out of print. So that book costs more than this book, which you should all get if you're interested in plants. This is the first one he mentioned, Plants of Deep South Texas. They're both really good. And the other one is real specific, much more specific to the island and plants out at the island. So it's a lot easier to find them in that book. But because I like plants so much, Robert paid extra for that book for me to get a used out of print book, but it's really good. So
yeah, I couldn't remember that. Another question mentioned that gardening promotes better health. Does McAllen or Edinburgh have community gardens? Yes. So my fiance actually has a community garden at her farm, which is run by UT Rio Grande Valley. So it's called the Hub of Prosperity, and they have plots. I don't know if they have any plots available right now, but they do have a community garden there. There's also a community garden in McAllen, coincidentally, very close by where that champion super old Texas ebony tree is. So it's right near Harvey, and I think the next street west of Main Street, which I think is 16th, maybe. But there's a fire. It's right next to one of the McAllen fire stations. Is the community garden there, and it is. I think the Goolsbys, John and Carol Goolsby, are very heavily involved in that community garden as well. And you might also be able to get information from Dr. Rosellis at UT-RGV. So yeah, there's certainly one in Edinburgh. Oh, Edinburgh Scenic Wetlands. I believe they have a community garden as well at their park, but I would call and ask them. It's been a while since I've driven by that. Moving on down. When discussing definitions of native plants, are there any recent local studies? This is from Jose Roberto Palmos. Are there any recent local studies, observations of plants migrating due to changing climates or observable effects in general to our local flora, especially with our widening extreme of temps? That's a great question, Jose, and I'm not sure. I can't think of any local studies thinking about plants. You know, actually one that I think comes to mind is actually the mangroves. So because the climate is getting warmer, and we're not experiencing as many freezes, it's suspected that going forward, the black mangroves are going to continue working their way up the coast and not die back as much because we're not going to be getting as much freezes. So I think that's one off the top example of that. Not necessarily related to climate change, but I think it's going to be working with climate change, but kind of the xerification or the desertification of our plant communities. So after Falcon Dam was put in the 50s, a lot of the tall riparian forests along the Rio Grande, places like Santa Ana and Benson, over time they've lost a lot of their tall trees because they're not getting the annual flooding that they used to. And so the habitats there are becoming more resembling more open canopy, not as many tall trees, more smaller trees, and different plant species. And so with climate change, I think the current model is that we're going to have longer periods without rain, but we're still going to get periodic really heavy rains. So we're still going to get a similar amount of rain for at least I think within the next 50 to 100 years, but there's going to be longer periods of time without it. So that means that there's going to be, periods where plants that are more reliant on having moist environments might not make it through. And then when it does rain, there might be flooding in areas that there might not usually be. And so that could change plant communities as well. So I hope that answers the question. I'm hoping to learn more about that. I need to talk to some of the local biology professors and see if any of them are doing stuff like that. Dr. Faria might, Dr. Gabler might. I'm not sure. Let's see, what else? Oh, I see a comment about from Melissa to the plant workshops, and they got little seeds from the potato tree and they fermented them. Oh, and they might have grown. Yes, please send me an email if you've grown a plant. I'm excited to see that. Yeah, Aaron Winger shared it. It's McAllen has a community vegetable garden at Harvey and 16th. Sorry, I'm very behind. Talking about creating an aviary. I am not I am not a handsy person. Like, I'm not a handyman, so not the right question for me. But I think there are a lot of resources online that you can find about creating aviaries. I have pigeons, but what I did is I just kind of created a mini aviary by using something that I bought for a catio, for an outdoor catio for my cat, and I just put hardware cloth on an existing cage, basically. Keep my pigeons there. Judy talking about carpenter bees. Not sure what. Well, okay. Some of the things that I often share about carpenter bees is that so they're solitary bees, and you can tell male and female from each other by seeing them. The males are usually golden and fuzzy. Golden fuzzy, and the females are the mostly black ones. So you can tell the difference. And they dig holes, they burrow holes in dead wood. So sometimes people don't like them because of that. But then they store pollen in that wood, in these little chambers in there, and that's where they lay their eggs, and then their young come out and eat the pollen. What's interesting is that there are other insects that are called kleptoparasites that will eat the pollen stores meant for the bee babies. So they're these really wild looking beetle, blister beetles. They're enormous. They're like 2 inches or so, and they're black and orange. And I've only seen them a few times, but they are kleptoparasites of carpenter bees. So where I used to see them was a large dead ash tree in a neighborhood in McAllen. And so there's tons of carpenter bees nesting in there. And then there was these blister beetles. Let's see. Question from Sharon. In a small yard, which plants and flowers would you recommend to attract hummingbirds and bees? Turk's cap is always the recommendation for hummingbirds. It's probably the best, most consistent nectar resource for hummingbirds. It also grows well in a variety of light. So you can grow it in full sun or you can grow it in shade. So it's very flexible in that regard. You can also trim it back pretty readily and it's going to come back. It's a very hardy plant. We lost a lot of the above ground material of it during 2021 freeze, but it came back with a vengeance from root tissue. In terms of flowers, for bees, I like wildflowers because they grow quick and you can just mow or trim them down once or twice a year. So things like cowpen daisy, things like the fire wheel, which is the Mexican blanket. Those are great for bees. Another great one for bees is goldenrod. So we have the southern seaside goldenrod, which is Solidago mexicana, and that one's fantastic for bees. That's a fall bloomer. So I love that plant. Honestly, one of the best plants for bees is just sunflowers. I know I mentioned that in my native plant project talk, but just keep a sunflower or two in your yard, and you're going to attract a lot of native bee species. From Joyce, regarding invasive species, are we seeing lanternflies here? No, we're not, as far as I'm aware, seeing any lanternflies. And I don't suspect, I can't recall actually off the top of my head what plants they're going to in northern areas. But I haven't heard any mention of lanternflies coming down here. Let's see, anything else? Contact information. I will put my my personal email in here actually. And that's my work email. Back to Michelle has a Brazilian buttonbush. I'm wondering if it's considered invasive because it makes a lot of seeds per head. I also wonder what. Sorry, I lost that question. Let me make the chat big. I'm not sure what Brazilian buttonbush looks like, so I can't visualize that plant. I'm not sure if I'm familiar with it. Is it? It's not Brazilian.
Yeah, I'll even turn on my camera for this. It's a small little round fluffy thistle type purple flower, but it
Okay.
doesn't, but it's not any of the other ones that are local to here because I've looked at all of them and I had to go on Twitter and ask, and that's when somebody was like Brazilian button, they showed it to me. And it and it grows along highways in Brazil. That's what I read. And I was like, well, I don't know how it got over here. I imagine a bird or something. And it has some medicinal qualities to it that I saw were like interesting, like for like snake bites and things like that. But interesting that it's over here.
Oh,
And
I just Googled that, and I am seeing. So you said it looks kind of like the thistle, right? Where it's like the
uh-huh.
purple. I've
Mhm.
seen that plant growing in the valley, so I would suspect that it's not considered invasive. If it hasn't spread a ton everywhere. For those folks who are over in Cameron County, perhaps you can educate me on this. But I certainly have not seen it much in Hidalgo County. For a plant to really, in my mind, be considered invasive, is it has to start damaging the local ecosystem, right? So there are plenty of plants that are not quote unquote native to the area that don't really seem to harm things that don't act as an invasive. So it could be something where you just are going to have a local population of it in your yard, but won't end up really spreading a ton elsewhere. What I would do is pay attention to how it behaves in your yard. And if it starts to be like, oh, it's growing everywhere, then I might be a little concerned.
Okay.
start to try to pull it out before it spreads too much. But that's kind of just my pragmatic approach. I'm seeing from Jake Reinbolt touched about the negative impact on that grass lawns have on the environment. He despise grass lawns. And I share this with people very frequently. There's a term to describe those kinds of environments. Monocultures. I believe the term is monoculture that you're looking for. I hope that answers your question, Jake. That's the only one that I can think of that would apply to that. But where there's one species that's used a ton, I would call it a monoculture. Catherine, subspecies in white-eyed vireo, non-migratory shorter wings. Are there other local bird species that show the same or similar kinds? Yeah, common yellowthroat. So that's a species of warbler. And we have a local subspecies called the Brownsville common yellowthroat. And it's the same pattern where they have shorter primaries proportionally than the migratory common yellowthroats do. So that's the only one I can think off the top of my head. I'm sure there are other examples of this because there are assuredly other birds that breed here in the valley and are mostly resident, and then ones that are the same species but breed elsewhere and are migratory. So that's kind of the situation based off of those two, the white-eyed vireo and the common yellowthroat, that you need to see that sort of wing difference. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I'm seeing Jake saying homogeneous or homogeneous. Yeah. All right.
Any other questions for John? The one thing I was going to tell you guys is in John's Native Plant Project talk, he discusses a paper that he helped John Goolsby gather data on native trees versus tropical trees and that kind of thing. And he put a link to the paper, and we can also send you the paper. But Dr. Goolsby will be speaking to us on March 22nd on that very subject, urban sprawl and insect diversity. So
Nice.
yeah. And he goes in, I think he even shows pictures of the vacuum that they used in the
I'll have to try to go to that and go down memory lane. Yeah, Goolsby is, I mean, quite frankly, a badass. So I encourage all y'all to go see John Goolsby's talk. He's a really cool dude, and so is Carol. I hope Carol's there.
She hasn't been. She used to be a presenter on her and talk about the valley and why how its plant population was created and how this big wind comes off the mountains and the cold and she'd start throwing like all the different plants that are being wiped out by agriculture and this and that, and she'd have this little model and throw, and everybody be so like almost in tears at the end of it because she was so dramatic and
yeah,
such a
I
great.
Remember that.
Oh yeah,
I remember that presentation. She used to do it at Quinta all the time.
Mm-hmm.
That was a classic one.
Then she went back and started teaching again, and wasn't available for any more talks with us. But every time I contact John, I always say, and by the way, we'd love to have Carol too. So, because by this time, maybe she's retired again. I don't know, but.
I'm seeing a question here from Catherine or Daniel via Catherine. Do you know of any work done pertaining to sand or soil gradients with respect to concentrations of metal or nitrogen, for example, and their proximity to entertainment sites? May I ask what you mean by entertainment sites? Okay. I see the follow-up now. The fireworks and the distribution around the pier. I do not know the answer to that. I'm sorry. I don't want to speak on that because I just don't know. I don't know the answer to that one. I'd hope that some of the naturalist types or the people at the Sea Turtle Inc. might have more info on that. But yeah, sorry, I can't help there. All right. And
Didn't somebody ask about last name? Were they meaning Dr. Goolsby, or did I make that up that I saw that?
not sure.
Spell last name, please.
Yes. How do
Oh.
you spell the name?
Of Goolsby?
Yes,
Oh,
I put it in the chat.
GOOLSBY. Yeah. there
I
we
got
go.
it. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Sure. So he's coming up for us, but John, thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
We
Glad to.
We got a
Yeah, yeah.
double an intro, your whole ecosystem talk, and then the intro into native plants. And we're also going to have Christina Mild talking about invasives. We have to just set her date, and so we're looking forward to more plant talks, as I could go on always listening to plants, but we got to add in some herpetology and some fish and some,
Yeah, you can't be too biased.
no, that's what the
Plants
Native Plant
only,
Project
right?
is for, right?
Yeah, but yeah. Well, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with y'all, and thank you for continuing to support all these local nature places with your volunteering. I know I speak personally when I say thank you, and I'm sure a lot of the other places are very appreciative as well. So keep up all the great work that y'all do.
Thanks, John. We really appreciate you.
All right, bye bye.